room. And then the brother, was playing with the gun and accidentally shot the younger brother. A horrible case. And because of the high legal standard that he would have to know that would happen in Virginia, he could not be held accountable. We could tweak that law, we could tweak that language to make that law so that it would be easier to prosecute. And they did try to prosecute, and it was not successful.
All right, thank you. Chris.
I'd like to go back to what Philip said before the end of the break, and to tag along with what Gary said earlier, and the nice lady on the front row. As a police officer, a former police officer, 15 years, I've seen plenty of violence. I'm a current pastor, and I do have a concealed weapons permit. I think we look to solutions as far as gun security, offer that all guns should be secure. Background checks, agree with that. They should be great background checks. But I think we need to look at the culture itself. Why are we so much engrossed in violence? As we look to Hollywood, what sells? Violence sells. We look to video games, what sells? Violence sells. I think we need to look at that in our culture. And I think from a pastor's point of view, it's a faith issue. That if more people would return to the Lord and realize that every man is created in the image of God, that we wouldn't have the violence that we have these days. So the answer to me is very simple. Franklin Graham put it this week: if we put a pile of guns out there, these guns are not going to shoot themselves. Somebody has to put their hand on that weapon and has to fire it. It's a matter of the heart. So I believe if this country returned to the Lord, we would see less violence. Amen. Thank you.
All right. Next question.
My name's Tyler, and sort of to follow that up, I'm a father, a gun owner, and an agnostic. So some of that rings true for me, some of it doesn't. In America, if we managed to ban all firearms, if we removed all gun homicides, our homicide rate would still be higher than Canada's. We have a violence problem, not so much of a gun problem. We're a violent country, even if you remove all the gun violence. And it seems a little disingenuous to focus on gun violence and show a statistic about Australia where their gun violence went down. Well, what about their overall violent crime rate? Did it go down enough to justify forever surrendering your Second Amendment right?
Panel? Any
I think that
comments?
It's important to note that the number one choice of murder weapon with murderers is guns. So that's the largest percent of murders are committed with guns. It just makes murder easier.
But it doesn't mean there would be less murder or less suicide. Japan has a higher suicide rate than we do, and they don't ever use a gun, I don't think, or maybe just a few during a year, but yet they have a higher suicide rate. So the question is, does removing a tool change somebody from doing something they intend on doing? And I would argue not.
Well, I think
really.
that it's very interesting because in America we have a beautiful experiment in democracy where we let different states have different laws, and we see in states that have better background checks, better laws that vet people as to whether or not how you're trained before you're allowed to own a weapon or carry one in public, that we see less murder and less suicides, and those are very interesting correlations that I think that where we all share a culture.
Well, Vermont doesn't require a permit for anything, and they have one of the lowest crime rates in the country. They can carry open or concealed, no permit required,
And the highest
no training.
suicide rate.
Let me get to Damien.
But-
We haven't heard from you in a while. What are your thoughts?
Then we
about
go to
that?
give you other examples.
Since we're on the subject of suicide,
Right.
suicides are now the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S., and suicides actually outnumber homicides, what that gentleman said, by 2 to 1. And half suicides are caused by guns. I do believe in having the right to own a gun, but we do need to look at this serious issue. So what happens in a suicide, a person with a suicidal ideation in an impulse, in a crisis, that person, if they use the gun to commit suicide, very few people will live with a gunshot to the head, but there are many people that will live with an overdose of pills, for instance. So the issue of suicide is a serious one. It now outnumbers homicides, and we do need to look at that issue. Yeah.
Damien, thanks.
A couple of comments. We're a nation of laws, and our laws are effective based upon the concept of voluntary compliance. And the lady from Danville, when I listened to you mention that a sign that says firearms prohibited. Well, that's currently the law in Virginia. Any private property, you can prohibit people from bringing firearms inside. And what's going to happen is people like me, who's a retired police officer after 42 years of service, if I'm going to obey the law, I'm not going to go inside that building. I'll just ask everyone in here that is asking for more laws, tighter laws, stricter laws, more enforcement. I'm going to ask you, how's the cocaine problem working in your community? How is the heroin problem working in your community? At some point, we need to understand that, yes, there are things that we need to look at. And I can stand here after 42 years and tell you, anecdotally, there's a case in Franklin County where somebody wasn't found guilty, but I can tell you more cases where a parent was held responsible for their actions when he mishandled a gun. My position is we are a culture that has become very violent. One of the issues is the media. Now, the media means many things, Hollywood, and so forth. And I want to reiterate what I said earlier. In the past 20 years that I've been teaching college, in addition to being a chief of police and other positions, I have not read the first study that has addressed the culture of violence in our country, civility, and it's not a Black Lives Matter, it's not a White Lives Matter. It has to do with how people are treating other people. Damien, thank you for finally clearing up this misconception that people that commit crimes, it's because of mental illness. It's not because of mental illness, it's because of meanness, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Social.
I am a bit of a spiritual person, and we've heard again and again about God and guns. And I believe we're talking mostly of Christianity by and large, not exclusively. But I'm concerned when we're talking about Christianity and everyone's going around armed and saying, I'm ready to get the bad guy, and I'm ready at all times. I'm scanning the crowd at all times, ready to hurt somebody. What kind of mindset is that putting us in? And also, I'm also concerned about a bit of an idolatry of guns. That are we no longer putting our faith in the Lord? When we go about and we put our faith in a gun to protect us, we're no longer putting our faith in the Lord. We're no longer walking with Jesus. And I wonder if we've created a false idol.
Your question.
The President of the United States, this question is for the panel. The President of the United States said on CNN's town hall that he wanted to make it a little more difficult and a little more expensive to acquire a firearm. Why would he want to make it harder for a mother with 2 kids who is a rape survivor on a budget? Why would he want to make it harder, and his supporters obviously, why would they want to make it harder for her to protect herself and her family? And how is this not an infringement on the Second Amendment? Then this is for the entire panel.
It is an infringement on the Second Amendment, and for the president, it's more about politics than it is saving lives. There's no doubt about it. Our own governor also suffers from this affliction. It's all about guns. In fact, the people that call gun owners gun nuts, I find that they're the side that seems to be totally nuts about guns. Everything is a problem with the gun. You got to do this with a gun. You got to do that with a gun, rather than just leave it alone and not constantly be thinking about it everywhere they go. And so.
All right. Yes, sir. Your name.
Ray Nolan. I have more of a statement. I come from kind of a long line of responsible gun owners. Being one of the younger faces in this crowd, I, from the age of 8 years old, have owned my own firearm. I went through adolescence. I grew up as a teenager. I had plenty of times I was very mad. Never once did I try to pick up that firearm and cause harm to anyone else around me. At the same time, growing up in a home that had firearms, I more want to go the direction of kids getting their hands on firearms. I feel that it is much more of a problem with the parental guidance these days. My father had the parental guidance of a belt across my hind end, and it worked very well. And I have to say that I think, I live in the downtown area of this town, and I see groups of under teenagers walking around midnight. What are they doing out? Their parents should not let them out on the streets. They should not be out there available, to get involved in any kind of, criminal activity, because most of the time that's what happens that late at night with kids that are out and don't have any supervision.
So how much of a socioeconomic correlation is there with guns and gun violence?
There's a large socioeconomic factor when you know, these are social stressors that increase that risk of violence. When people are unemployed, well, you know, I guess the question to ask ourselves is, you know, why do youth, for instance, in low-income communities across America, why do some of them see the only way out of poverty is by selling drugs? Or why do they only see the way out of poverty is getting a gun and, you know, burglarizing a place? So that's the question in my mind. You know, how can we give more opportunities to youth to not see, you know, guns or involvement in gangs? How do we give them other options? How do we help them with other options rather than seeing that the only way out of poverty is through, you know, drug sales or burglarizing a place?
All right. Let's go to Kelly Gray over at our social media desk for a question online.
Okay, here's a question from Ed Powell, who he sent via email. This is to any of the panelists. Would you be willing to place a gun-free zone sign in front of your home, letting criminals know the inhabitants are unarmed? And if not, why do you insist on placing them in front of our schools?
Panel, anyone want to
Well,
grab
I would
that?
say that most of the public mass shootings, almost all of them, have been in gun-free zones. And it's not an accident. It's not you know, it's the kind of thing that you wish you'd get those kind of odds in Las Vegas. It's actually because criminals don't want to be on the losing end of what they're doing. You know, they're suicidal. They want to create damage before they go down. And take Cho. As soon as he saw resistance, and this is not uncommon, as soon as he saw resistance, the police actually came in the building and he saw one of them coming. It was over. He killed himself. The police never had to fire a shot. This is not uncommon. The Aurora shooter, he had theaters closer to him that were showing the same movie that night. He bypassed all of them to go to a smaller theater that was the only one of the group that was a gun-free zone, and then he proceeded to slaughter people.
I think that it's offensive to the victims' families who have universally spoken out, especially about the Aurora theater shooting, and the survivors who have said how impossible it would have been in that situation, that you would have hurt bystanders fighting back. I find it highly offensive that Philip thinks that he can put himself into that situation better than Colin Goddard, who was, by the way, you know, trained in gun ownership. He was in the Corps of Cadets for a couple years at Virginia Tech. And I think that he spoke very well when he said a gun would not have helped that day. And I think that it's offensive that people want to play, you know, when we talk about, you know, playing in, you know, the media and our culture of violence, I think it's offensive that people want to put themselves as if they're the shooter in the video game when the person who's lived it and survived it is telling what really happened those days. And I also find it offensive that that Philip's spreading this lie that it's all gun-free zones. That's not true. Umpqua Community College was not a gun-free zone.
It was by policy.
The malls were not gun-free zones.
Yeah, they
you know,
were.
Gabby Gifford's not a gun-free zone. You know,
That
there's
wasn't.
so
That
many.
was one of the two.
There's so many that aren't, and so I find this to be, you know, I find this to be very odd. Most of our shootings are in our homes. Those are not gun-free
That's
zones.
not a public shooting.
Umpqua is sort of a gun-free
Yeah,
zone
it was.
with some catches. You're absolutely right. Yeah, if you dig deeper into the legislation, you're right.
There were people that day with concealed carry who chose not to go because
But they were in a different
exactly-
building.
Correct.
Exactly
They were in
what
a
was
different
said.
building.
Correct. Let's get your name?
Jared.
Jared.
Rigney. I'm from Roanoke, Virginia, also a VCDL member. Ms. Coble, this question's for you. Mr. Stevens is an ex-law enforcement officer. Mr. Cabezas is a professional licensed counselor. Mr. Van Cleve, as well as an instructor in firearms and an ex-law enforcement officer. I ask you, what is your professional background that contribute to a professional opinion about these topics?
I mean, I don't know that Philip has a degree in guns. I'm a mother and I'm an educated person. I've educated myself on this topic. I think that anyone who is not a man would not face that question. Thank you very much, sir.
Oh, you're a sexist now.
Benny David, I'm not sure where to start. The worst,
Pick a place.
worst feeling I can ever imagine is being in a place like this where nobody's allowed to have a gun and everybody knows that, and one person decides to disobey that rule, wants to come in and assert himself over everybody. Could you imagine sitting here and watching somebody come in with a gun and start shooting you?
Well, let's
and
not
working this
forget
way?
our
Well, I mean, we
law
have armed
enforcement.
guards here, but
Right.
I'm saying if we were in a school, we were in a restaurant, a movie theater where you're not allowed to have a gun. And that's just a scary thought to me, that you'd be there defenseless, whatever. But the point I want to make, and I guess kind of a question, I think education is the key. Our homes, the world is full of dangers. Our children, we don't worry about them sticking their fingers in light sockets, grabbing knives out of the drawers and cutting each other up, jumping off the top of the stairs, because we train them. If you start at a younger age and teach them what this gun is, teach them how to use it, teach them safe ways to do it. I may be aged myself. When I was a youngster, we run around with toy guns shooting at each other. We watched shoot 'em ups on TV, and I never remember hearing anybody shooting each other. Of course, we had God in there then, or whatever. But education is the key. Kids are curious. If this thing's hidden away and it's locked away, it's a box, you can never touch it, they're going to want to touch it. But if you take it out and show them how to use it safely, that's another thing. And everybody, adults need education. Even the police who talk about the police. It's not a combat situation.
I can certainly speak to young children, and I tell my son his nose is available to him at all times, and I tell him not to pick it, but it does not stop him. So the curiosity can sometimes be constant.
Barry, any thoughts from you on this?
Oh, I'm just listening. I'm enjoying every minute.
You know, okay.
He's smart, isn't he? Okay. First of all, I want to thank someone from Moms Demand Action for being here, because moms do care. And when moms do care, they can change a lot of lives, because mothers know what's going on in the world, and mothers don't mind taking action. So I thank you for being here. You have a right to be here, just like the rest of us in this room do. So thank you very much for being here. Secondly, my point that I want to make, or the question I want to ask is, why is it can we buy insurance, take classes to learn how to drive, go through all of this process to be able to get behind the wheel of a car, which is a type of weapon. It can be a weapon. We go through lots of training for that. We have to pass a test. But we can go and buy a gun and not know anything about using it, not knowing any safety regulations, any safety rules. Why can we not at least agree or work towards having some mandatory required training for people that wish to have weapons? In some ways, I think that would make it a lot safer. At least you know how to load your gun, or to make sure that if you say it's empty, it really is empty because you have looked at it. Why can't we at least do something about that?
Well, for one thing, it's a right. An automobile isn't a right. That's a privilege. That's up to the state. They can license it however they want. They can tell you can't drive for whatever reason they pull out of the air. But our founding fathers enshrined in the Constitution our right to have a gun. That makes it a very different subject. When the government starts mandating, they're infringing on that right. And the trouble is, when you let the government start setting standards, we know where bureaucracies go with this stuff. I mean, we'll be doing all kinds of crazy stuff to satisfy some bureaucrat.
I know, the government started taking the lead out of water, and everything's been worse since then.
It's not.
Just because the government does some stuff that's okay doesn't mean it's all okay.
True, too.
I went to Virginia Tech, kind of. I was expelled, suspended, whatever you want to call it.
This is the place you really want to.
I signed up, ultimately signed up for the class that the shooter went into first, from what I understand. I did not follow Tech's policy because it was not, at the time, illegal. I carried in class. Barry, you said that would be a terrible situation.
That's right.
The first classroom the shooter walks into, it would be bad for somebody there equal force. Now, if you're saying that I am untrained and I don't have combat experience and all of that, is it fair and equal to say that shooter walking through that nice silhouetted door, looking at a class of 40 people, has the same disadvantage?
He's not got the disadvantage because he's firing indiscriminately, whereas you're trying to pick a single target and do it and maintain your focus on that one target and still avoid all of the other students in that room, and you're going to do it on the spur of the moment in a moment of panic.
Let's say I accidentally hit 3 or 4. Let's say worst case scenario. Let's just say that accidentally happens.
And it probably will.
30 dead, or 3 or 4 accidentally. I mean, just spitballing there.
I would disagree with this. From what I've seen over and over in these scenarios is when the bullets start to fly, everybody hits the floor. Everybody's laying flat. They're all playing dead. So if you're engaging somebody, even in the movie theater, the same thing happened there. You're basically firing well over everybody. You'd have to go out of your way to hit one of these other people. They're not running around. They're dropping and playing dead.
I would.
In the case
So
of Virginia Tech, it was 11 minutes until the police showed up. Is that
I have a question
right?
for our mental health expert. How do young males and alcohol? How do those things mix with guns? Does that mix well or poorly?
Yeah, no,
When alcohol don't mix well with anything.
when you have, let's say you have an argument and add alcohol to it or substance use and add a gun, 5 to 7 times more likely that a shooting is going to happen. So substance abuse, it will make a
is
difference.
substance abuse a problem on college campuses?
Sure.
Are we
Yeah.
allowed to discriminate against college students? Is that what we're gonna? That's a
allowed to
portion
set
of
policies.
the environment, or that's a portion of our culture that we can discriminate against. We can
You can
stereotype
choose
like
not
that.
to go to Virginia Tech. You can choose to go to Liberty.
We didn't have that option at the time, ma'am.
You didn't have the option to go to
They
Liberty?
didn't allow carry at Liberty back then.
Well, I mean, you can take that up with any private college. They set their own policies. So
I agree. Can I ask one more question?
Thank you.
Real quick, one comment and then just a question. My name's Jeff Giles. I'm the owner of Black Dog Sporting Goods. I'm a Class 3 federal firearms license in Evington. So I do have a little bit of expertise in what we're talking about today. I can't tell you how many times I've had customers come to me after the fact. Okay? People that were strongly against guns and have something happen. They show up at my door with a story for me. It's never a good story. They leave with a gun. Okay? Not all guns are bad. They're simply a tool. Earlier you made a statement that no weapon was used. When Bob, I believe it is, there was a box cutter. His face was cut. It's a tool. That's all it is. So, but not to detract from that, but my problem with most of the discussions about gun control is we're not talking about, when you talk about background checks not being effective, you're talking about law-abiding citizens. I've had a handful of people leave my shop in handcuffs because they were not very smart, and they were criminals, and they came and the background check was effective. They left in a squad car. For the most part, though, gun violence, those guys don't show up at my doorstep.
Do you have a question?
I do. Why can't we refocus? Instead of trying to keep the guns out of the hands of law-abiding citizens, why don't we focus on criminals?
I think that's exactly what a background check is designed to do. If we have background checks on all sales, I think what you're seeing is you're selling to somebody and they're turning around and basically becoming a criminal by selling to a criminal. That's a criminal activity, but it's impossible to prosecute.
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we have a problem not only with guns, like it was brought up earlier. We have methamphetamine on the streets. We have heroin. We have cocaine. We have illegal guns being bought. What we're talking about in here, imposing new laws, stricter background checks, those apply to law-abiding citizens. If you want to keep the guns out of the hands of a criminal, don't look at the background checks we do. Look at downtown in a back alley. Look at the backside of any building. Look at the people, straw purchases, like you're saying. But that's not a law. That's not a law-abiding citizen.
Let's raise the
buying at a
cost
dealer.
of straw purchasing. Let's make it easier to prosecute a straw purchaser.
You have to catch them, and that's the trick.
You have to be able to prosecute them.
You have to catch them before you can prosecute them.
How many times on Channel 13 do you see a criminal that shot somebody or robs a place, and they've also got that charge on there of a convicted felon having a firearm? It looks like a large percentage of the time.
But how often do we ever hear of someone getting in trouble for selling that gun to them? Never. Because you can post a gun on Facebook, you can post a gun on Arms List, we can trace it back that that's how you sold it to them, and you literally cannot be prosecuted if you say, I didn't know. That's it. That's all.
They surveyed 100 prisoners in Illinois and asked them where they got their guns. 97% got them off the street. They didn't go through any of this.
We're going to wrap up shortly. Let me share something with you that I don't tell a lot of people about, but I'm not sure how pertinent it is to our discussion. But when I was about 7, I went into my parents' bedroom, into a cigar box, where I knew there was a gun, I knew there was a bullet. I took the gun and the bullet to our backyard, put the bullet in the gun, not knowing what was going to happen, took the gun, pointed it at the ground, and fired it. Some of my friends were there in the backyard with me. When I think back of that day, it's amazing on some levels that I didn't kill one of them or kill myself. Are my parents to blame? Probably. We're going to be wrapping up here very shortly. So we want to give our panelists, who now you can clap for, hopefully, because I think they've done a great job. And this discussion is ongoing. This discussion is not going to end because, as we've seen, there are so many different opinions about where we need to be with gun laws, with violence in guns. I mean, there's just background checks, everything, right? But we want to give our panelists each an opportunity to have a few words before we close this evening. Barry, why don't we start with you?
And can you tell me what your first and last name is and what your title is?
All of the panelists have made such good points. We're sitting here talking about gun violence. And when you break gun violence down,
you don't have to go into that if you don't want to.
I think we've touched on most of those segments in some aspect tonight. One of them is
I was here today just to see
accidental
try to get the
shootings.
opinions of the
Accidental
folks,
shootings
and see
account
what
for
the
a large percentage
consensus
of
was
people that
amongst
are injured or
everybody.
killed every year. What do we do to cut down on and prevent accidental shootings,
pleased
especially
for
children?
one, everybody wants to come to a
Again, it goes back to
resolution.
education and trying to
But I was
encourage
also
parents
frustrated at the
to
same
to
time
take
because
care of
everybody
these
spoke
weapons and
about
make them safe.
losing their,
Don't have them
freedoms.
available to the children.
And once you
We
start
didn't spend a lot of time
losing your
on
freedoms, you'll never
suicide.
get back.
As
so
Damien
even
said,
letting,
half of the suicides that occur in
executive
this country in any
resolutions
given
and
year
everybody's
are
opinion in there
committed
trying to
with
allow,
firearms. Normally because when the
you're just losing your
impulse
freedoms,
comes,
and
the
it starts
firearm
at
is the
the
most
Second
convenient
Amendment, then it's the First Amendment, then
object
it's all the
available
amendments, and
to
then,
cause the death of that person. Again, if these people, the mental health facilities are there. Horizon Behavioral Services is unbelievably a wonderful organization. Some way to get to people when they have these impulses, if they could get to the mental health facility rather than follow through with that impulse and kill themselves. Stranger on stranger violence, a large percentage of it, and we've kind of nibbled at the edges here. And again, we referenced the CDC earlier tonight. These are CDC statistics. A lot of those are gangs and drugs. A large percentage of this stranger on stranger violence, where these weapons are used to kill one another, drugs and gangs. What do we do about drugs and gangs? Well, gangs, this is a social and a community problem. We can do that here.
Thank you.
Drugs, like Gary said, we've been fighting drugs now since President Nixon declared war on drugs in 1970. We haven't done much good with that.
Yeah, I also appreciate this discussion and hope it continues. I would say that for those that continue to insist of a correlation between mental health and violence, I would say that in order to have a more helpful conversation, I think we need to define what mental health is. Mental illness is such a broad topic. Are we talking about serious mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder? Or are we talking about mild depression? So I think we need to talk about specific diagnosis before we can get into a correlation between mental illness and violence. That was one point I was want to make. And the other point is that the presumption of, again, violence and mental illness really stigmatizes an entire group of people that has profound effects. And we need to think about that. Whether it's guns and people, we don't live in isolation from societal factors and historical influence. So, I think it's important to keep that in mind as we continue to have this discussion, and because the profound effect of stigma is, it stops people from wanting to be around people with mental illness. It stops people from wanting to employ people with mental illness, and for the mentally ill, they don't want to say what their symptoms are because they're, scared of being labeled as violent. So they become withdrawn, they become isolated, and that's not a good thing for anyone. So, so thank you.
Well, I think the bottom line for a lot of this is while we're trying to figure out what to do about the people that are dangerous out there that are murdering, raping, and robbing, although, by the way, our violent crime rate is half of what it was 20 years ago. So it actually, contrary to the media, we were actually not doing as bad as we were 20 years ago. With all these guns in circulation, crimes have been going down. But the main thing is, whatever goes wrong, whether it be Cho slipping through the cracks or whatever, the belief of my organization is that people need to be able to protect themselves. Innocent life needs to be able to protect it. A mother needs to be able to protect her children, and so forth. So that's why our push is to make sure that decent, law-abiding people have the access to firearms for self-defense, and they should be able to take them anywhere they go, because criminals take their guns everywhere they go.
Catherine, you get the last word.
I would say that guns don't save lives. Emergency medicine physicians save lives. And that I think as we were talking about suicide, that it's just very important to, as we talk about folks, and gun violence, to just remember that pushing guns onto everyone, maybe a gun isn't right for you, and that's okay. You're allowed to make that decision, and I don't know that if we're pushing everyone that you have to be your own police force, that you have to be trained and spend all this time training. That's not how I want to live. I want to live in communion with my community. I want to be able to go out and talk to people and feel like we're not in opposition, and I think that making sure that we're concentrating a little bit more on making sure we're vetting people is just a very important thing. Let's make sure that we're preventing dangerous people from having access to weapons.
Thank you all for a very heartfelt and thoughtful discussion tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, you think so? Give them a round of applause. Thank you. And we thank you on live for being a part of our Your Voice, Your Future Town Hall. We'll see you next time. Good night.